everyone. We'll get started. Welcome to the Q&A Cafe here at the Georgetown Club. It's good to have you all here, and our guest, Abbe Lowell, taking a break from so many hats that you wear. Professor, litigator, handholder, advice giver, and as I can say...
Dog walker.
Dog walker, yes. Husband, Georgetowner.
All the things, yeah.
But as I can say also, as my other life as a producer at Face the Nation, a wonderful legal guest.
Thank you for being here. Glad to be here.
He can come in, and when it's not just about his own cases, though usually you're booked for your own cases, but and I can just imagine how wonderful it is for the students in your class, because you're really good at untying knots.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you one to untie right at the beginning.
All right.
Because I'm really confused by this Mark Meadows.
Deep end of the pool. Okay,
well,
go ahead.
You know, because when this story broke last night, and we're doing this on October 25th, just for those of you watching on TV, it was that he got an immunity deal. And then it became lots of, I'm not really clear what he got.
Well, I'm not clear what he got either. So
that
remember
tells us everything.
No, but here, all right. But here's the way the Mark Meadows things unfolds in a nutshell. So Mark Meadows is subpoenaed by Congress, for example, to provide information for the January 6th committee. He does two things. He starts down the path of cooperating and providing some documents, and says he'll show up, and then he stops doing that and changes his mind. He asserts that now he doesn't have to go because he is the highest level of senior advisor to the president who can bask in the protection of the president's executive privilege. There is a legal controversy as to whether or not at a certain level of White House advisor, you don't even have to show up at Congress, as opposed to showing up and answering questions one by one, asserting executive privilege like you might attorney-client privilege or any other privilege. He chose not to come. He says he was ordered by the president not to go. Of course, the president decides to tell people not to go or not to go in a way that he does it, which doesn't always end up public. Bottom line is he's held in contempt. The statute in which he's held into contempt was passed after the earliest parts of the United States. People may not know contempt of Congress is a misdemeanor. It's only punishable by up to a year in jail and something like a $1,000 fine. So he's held in contempt. It's passed to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The U.S. Attorney's Office takes the case, prosecutes him, and he's convicted. And so then the question is, what happens next? And so he's on appeal, et cetera, as was Steve Bannon, as others. And now it unfolds as to whether or not immunity can be granted and whether or not what would happen next. But the story of Mark Meadows is interesting because of more than one reason. One is the interplay between the congressional branch and the executive branch. Congress only has three ways that it can enforce its subpoena power. Up until the early part of the 1900s, there were about 7 occasions in history where the Congress sent out their sergeant of arms to go arrest somebody and bring them to the well of the Capitol. People think there's a jail at the bottom of the Capitol. It's not. It's where George Washington was going to be buried. There's no gate there. It's just a cave. What they did do is put people up at hotels, including the Willard Hotel. The second way they can do it is to make a referral to the U.S. Attorney, which worked great when the U.S. Attorney is of the same party as the Congress that has held somebody in contempt, which has not always happened, in which case the U.S. Attorney won't bring the case. In this case, they did. The third is to bring a lawsuit, which has happened repeatedly in the Trump case. But what happens there is, you know how long it takes to litigate a case. So, for example, in the committee's attempts to get President Trump's tax records, it took years. And by then, he was out of office, and they just dumped it out. So it's a complicated set of events, but it's very interesting both legally and historically and politically.
Why would some of the analysts be saying last night that this would be bad for Jack Smith's case if Meadows has immunity?
Bad for his case. Well, so remember again, there's two parallel lines going on. The January 6th Congress is done with its report, and now Jack Smith takes over as special counsel and is looking at whether or not he can bring people to bear both to the indictment that's already in effect and whatever else he'll charge. Getting the ability to call Mark Meadows as a witness is not a bad thing for a prosecution, as, by the way, now that all these people are pleading guilty in Georgia, they don't have an ability probably to assert the Fifth Amendment if they're called as witnesses. So it's a net gain, at least for the testimony. And why people would say that it would be bad,
the only
thing that would be bad is if this is what people might be referring to. If everybody remembers Iran-Contra, everybody remembers the famous summer testimony of Oliver North in his uniform, etc. And he was given immunity.
With
and then
Brendan Sullivan sitting beside him.
With my friend and mentor, Brendan
Yes.
Sullivan, in this famous line that he's uttered that we all say afterwards when he looked, and the chairperson, which was Senator Inouye, a very, very fair-minded person, and they were yelling at each other because they were asking bad questions, and Brendan objected, and the senator said, you don't have these rights in this hearing, and he said, Senator, I am not a potted plant. And that's where that phrase comes from. So here's the problem with congressional immunity affecting the executive branch. If Congress or any other entity gives somebody immunity, then a prosecutor has to prove that they didn't use any of the immunized testimony in their prosecution.
Okay.
Because otherwise the immunity wouldn't bear what it's supposed to do. And in the Oliver North case, they weren't able to do that because the prosecutors couldn't show that the witnesses they called or the people that they brought into the grand jury or the documents were not informed by Oliver North's immunity. So if a prosecutor can't show that it's completely separate, the case can't go forward, and that's why Oliver North's conviction was overturned. So immunity might be what people are talking about.
What is Mark Meadows' end game here for his lawyers? What?
Well, I mean, for one thing, he doesn't want to have to follow the ball through the criminal proceeding all the way to an appeal. I mean, I don't know what the sentence would be ultimately, but understand that, as I said, contempt statute is a misdemeanor. I don't know what his relationship is. I think his end game now, obviously, is I don't want to get charged for anything else. Remember, Jack Smith did something that's very strategically interesting. When he decided that there was a case to be brought against former President Trump, he brought the narrowest possible case that he could on January 6th. He did not bring the widest charge of insurrection. What he brought was a single case against him. He listed that there were unindicted co-conspirators, but he didn't want an 11 defendant case as occurred in Georgia. And the reason he didn't want that, for any number of reasons, but one is he wants the case to start, middle, and end, and he wants it to be done expeditiously, I assume, both because of justice, but he wants America to know what happened. That being the case, I suspect that people like Meadows and others don't want to end up being called or at least being charged. Who knows? I haven't spoken to them.
He's unique in this basket of
He's very unique because he's the highest level, he being Meadows.
Yeah.
Highest level advisor to the president, chief of staff, which is somewhat said to be the alter ego of the president for purposes of whether you have broad immunity. So he is unique in that regard.
Right. Yeah. Well, legally, but depending on the president, you're so
And
many
also
different
depending
things,
on, and then the other thing is, and this is not legal as more as it is politically and optically speaking, it's hard to know who the people that were surrounding the president, the former president, I should say, perish the thought, at least personally speaking, whether they'll still be his allies. I mean,
well, look what we're
Jenna
seeing.
Ellis is not an ally any longer.
I wanted to
Sidney
get to that.
is not an ally anymore, and Cheeseborough is not an ally anymore. So who knows?
Right. So as you've watched this last week and this week roll out with these people, they're not doing plea deals. They're just pleading guilty, right?
No, it's a plea deal.
These are plea deals. So they won't do any jail. They'll have
so
probation.
far, no jail.
Okay. And is that going to hold that they won't get jail?
It's going to hold in Georgia that they get no jail if they satisfy the terms of their agreement. Now, they're all a little different.
Yeah.
They're all pleading to slightly different things. They've negotiated, I guess, all of them are lawyers so far, and they're all trying to negotiate deals that will give them some hope that they can maintain their legal license thereafter.
Did any of this surprise you? These starting to happen?
No.
Like dominoes falling?
No, it doesn't surprise me for two reasons. One, if they were convicted for the things for which they were charged, depending on how old they are and how much they want to work in the future, preserving their ability to be lawyers, if that's possible. By the way, it's not automatic. Just because they have a deal that might save them from their legal license being taken, there will still be bar events in each of these states that could independently decide that they violated enough of the ethics laws. But if they had the possibility of doing that versus a certainty that they'd lose that license, and a deal in which they're not going to go to jail, and they have to do community service or write I'm a bad person to the citizens of Georgia and pay a minimal fine, you would take that deal depending.
Do you think this is a good example of lawyers taking advice from their lawyers?
In which regard? How they
And,
got in
and that
trouble,
they're
or how they
taking
got
that
out?
these deal that they're pleading guilty.
Sure. I don't know that anybody takes a deal or doesn't take a deal without especially talking to somebody they decided was competent enough to be their counsel.
Right.
I think they're very motivated for the reasons I said. Think about it. Anybody is already indicted. If they have the ability to end their indictment with a plea that, number one, says I'm not going to jail,
Yeah.
and number two, says I might be able to maintain my livelihood, that would be, by most people, a pretty good deal to
That would be a
take,
good
notwithstanding what you might have as a good defense.
You don't get to keep your reputation, though.
They may have lost their reputation long before they were charged.
So are you anticipating more of these to happen? I mean,
That's
is it-
interesting now, because we're getting to the group, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have an expectation that Rudy Giuliani will take a deal, for example. He might, but I would be
Are
surprised
these,
about that one.
are these deals being made as almost a triage to,
Well, I think it
get-
puts pressure on the next group up, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
what, there were, how many others? There were 3, and there were 16, so I don't know, there's still a dozen
we
left.
can call a lifeline if we need to?
There's a dozen left. So I guess as you get to the very higher ups, I'm not sure. I mean, there's former Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark, and there's
Yeah.
Rudy Giuliani, and there are people at a higher level. I'm not surprised that people like Jenna Ellis or even Sidney Powell would take a deal. I would be surprised if somebody like Rudy Giuliani took a deal.
What about former President Trump's valet, Nauta? A lot of people have, I mean, I say this jokingly in a way, but you know, they say, well, when he's not outside, Trump keeps him locked in a room where the prosecutor can't get to him. But I'm just making light. But he would be clearly a very desirable defendant to flip.
What you don't know, and maybe we'll find out as the case unfolds, is in a traditional prosecutorial progression, somebody in the prosecutor's office would have reached out to somebody representing him.
At the outset.
Not day one, but
But by
you know,
now.
But before they charged.
Yeah, yeah.
And see whether he was interested in working out a deal. I have to assume that happened. We don't know. They may not have done it in the same way, because sometimes if they think somebody is so aligned with the principal target, they'll inform the principal target, or something will go awry in that, so it might not have happened, but mostly it did. Then they bring the charge to see whether or not the person will change his, her, or their mind. I mean, I've had I've had several cases in which I represented somebody with a co-defendant. They sought the co-defendant to become a cooperating witness against my client. The person didn't do it. They decided to bring the indictment to see if it would change the dynamic. Luckily for my principal client, that never happened, but it wouldn't be surprising if it happened here.
Rudy Giuliani could take a plea deal and not have to go to jail?
Well, could that be? I'd be, just as much as I said I'd be surprised if he took a deal, I would be very surprised if the prosecutor offered him a deal that didn't have any jail in it.
Yeah, interesting.
I don't think so. I think some people are already criticizing the DA for the deals that she's made. I don't think it's a crazy idea not to require some of those people like Jenna Ellis to go to jail. I think she would not be able to withstand the criticism, appropriately so, if somebody at the top of the conspiracy, who should have known better, and at least the evidence that looks like there exists probably did know better, was able to get out of his case without something like that.
Who is Giuliani's lawyer right now?
I really don't know, because then he'd lose one, and
Yeah,
what's
a lot of them cycle
or lose,
through.
yeah, right. And
Well,
then
I
that's
mean,
other
Trump-
ironic about this all, at least from my perspective, because I have a dog in this fight a bit. Is
And we'll
that,
get to that dog.
All right, so what's interesting is that Robert Costello, his longtime lawyer, throughout this last term of office, has now sued him because he has not paid his
Not
legal
been paid,
bills.
yeah.
So I don't know who his lawyer is now. You hear these stories about Giuliani having to sell his house or assets or finding, I don't know who his lawyer is right now, but whoever his lawyer is a very busy person.
And if you were that lawyer, what would you be advising him at this point?
Move out of the country? No, that's not not a good piece of advice. Sorry, that was a joke. If anybody's
Yeah, we've been
listening, that
joking
was
a little
joke.
bit here.
What would I advise? I forgot his age, but Rudy is not
He's up
at the
there.
beginning of his
Yeah,
career.
he could be 80.
He's got all kinds of civil and other liabilities.
Yeah.
I don't see that with as many things as he's going through right now, at the end of the day, there's a clear path to both freedom and liability free.
Yeah.
A very wise lawyer who I respect coins the expression that sometimes if you're a good lawyer, you have to tell a client who is faced with a really terrible thing and an also very terrible thing that you have to take the lesser of the terrible things. So if there was a path for him to say, I don't want to be in 3 cases, 4 lawsuits, a disciplinary hearing, maybe there's a global settlement he could do, it would be very challenging to negotiate that.
So let's go up a level. Is there a scenario in which Donald Trump could take a deal on myriad cases, get whatever, not have to go to jail, put this behind him, and then just sail on running for president?
No. None of those things could happen in an order and in a time frame that would transpire before November of 2024.
What are the gates that are intransigent? I mean, what are the gates where that's non-negotiable?
So right now, the case in Georgia is scheduled for trial, I think, March. Right? And then I think the first case with Jack Smith is in not far after that, I think.
Right.
So both of those people would have to agree to a deal.
Yeah.
And first of all, let's talk about the defendant, Trump himself. Every time he gets indictment, his approval rating goes up. Every time he says this is a farce and a witch hunt, his approval rating. When I say approval rating, I mean in his base, in the people who believe in him.
But his fundraising goes up also.
And apparently that's true as well. That being the case, the odds that he would take a deal and admit that he did something wrong, there's no prosecutor in the United States presently with a case against former President Trump that would allow him a deal in which he didn't have to admit some wrongdoing. Not one. And that being the case, then I doubt either side would get there. So that gate is a big gate. That's a wall. That's a bigger wall than Trump's border wall. That one doesn't have any holes in it. Yeah. That's not going to happen. If it could happen, then he still has to deal with, 2 cases that the special counsel has brought, 1 case in Georgia, 1 case in New York. I mean, just do the math. I mean, there's not that many months and that many courtrooms and that many defendants and that many prosecutors to get that all done between October of 2023 and November of 2024. The better question is, will any of his cases go to trial before November of 2024?
Well, and that's the one. That's the big question everybody asks. And is it answerable?
Not completely.
Yeah.
I think at least the judges who have the cases have indicated a schedule that could work. His lawyers are clever enough to figure out all the bells and levers and ways to try to take appeals that would delay, seek more information that could delay. I would say that if the judges do their job, which happens when you're representing somebody who's not the former president, and keeps people on their schedule, that one of those cases, maybe more than one, but at least one will go to trial before November of 2024.
A Trump question that's kind of personal. Trump famously came to town and asked various lawyers to take him on as a client. I know one who didn't. I know one who was asked and didn't. I'm sure there are others. Did he ever approach you?
The way I can answer this question is to say that the Washington Post did an article which indicated that I was among the people that President Trump had asked on more than one occasion to advise him. And the Washington Post article indicated, as the record would show, that I am not one of his lawyers.
There you go. Thank you. What was different when Jared and Ivanka approached you? And it may have just been Jared. I don't know. It's often said Jared and Ivanka. But...
True. True that it's often said. So I was approached by Jared initially in June of 2017, and let's lay the foundation for that. First of all, I do not judge my clients based on their political affiliation. All lawyers have to decide their lines, right? There are things I could not do as a lawyer in good conscience. Everybody does it differently. In the United States, we do cherish that everybody should have a lawyer, and that's part of our foundation. Indeed, I think people in this room or in the audience knows the most famous of those stories. The most famous of those stories is John Adams. John Adams represented the British troops that were involved in the Boston Massacre and represented them at trial and got them acquitted. And it didn't stop him from being the President of the United States. So we have a long tradition of people rising to the occasion of doing their job as lawyers, representing their clients.
Did even the guilty deserve a defense? Is that?
No, I paused.
You would never use the word guilty.
Exactly.
The charge.
You caused me pause when you said the word guilty.
Okay, and that's because I'm
guilty is the result of a judicial process in which either a jury finds beyond reasonable doubt that somebody did it, or somebody admits to doing it and pleads guilty themselves. Nobody charged is guilty until somebody says they're guilty. If you're asking whether or not people should represent people who, quote, did it, end quote, that's more complicated, because very often somebody is charged who did something but not it. And I don't mean to digress from the Jared question, but a good example is my representation of former Senator and presidential candidate John Edwards.
Yes, fascinating case.
He was indicted for accepting an illegal campaign contribution. What's his illegal campaign contribution? It was that people who were his friends were giving the woman with whom he was having an affair money to basically, while he was running for president, have some place to go and some place to live, and ultimately, when she had a child, to help provide the care of that child. That was deemed to be a campaign contribution because it happened while he was running for office. Nobody on the planet Earth had ever said that that could be a campaign contribution, but a prosecutor, who, by the way, happens to be the special counsel prosecuting Donald Trump, named Jack Smith, brought that case.
So you
John
know Jack
Edwards
Smith.
did something. He also was involved in another of my cases.
Okay.
So John Edwards did something. He did something that people might find to be morally objectionable or unelectable or despisable, but he didn't commit that felony. So consequently, people do things and sometimes they're overcharged. That's the basis when you paused me when you said the word guilty.
And I really should have said that anybody who's been charged deserves defense.
Not only deserves it, our system depends on it.
Yeah.
What makes the United States different than every country in the world is that we have this advocacy, we have this, adversarial system where we cause the government, before they take away somebody's liberty, to prove at the highest level of proof, beyond reasonable doubt, where you get to participate in every way. I mean, look at what's happening with the people who are dissidents in Russia, or any other place that is a totalitarian or various forms of draconian administrations. We don't do that. Not only is it everybody deserves it, our system depends on it. When people yell at me for the people I represent because they're controversial people and think they can hold the lawyers responsible, I have a tendency to want to write them or call them back when they leave nasty messages and say to them something like, I get your point, but you'd be the first to call me if it was your sister in trouble, right? And that's what people forget. So going back to your initial question. So laying the foundation. So the Trumps come to office in January of 17. There's this notion that there was interference by Russia in the 2016 election. There was immediately pushback to say, that didn't happen. And so somebody like Jared Kushner, who at the time was two things. He was the senior advisor to the President of the United States, and he was a relative. Says, look, I have a congressional investigation, and there's this special counsel investigation, and it's about this thing that has been alleged in the media that we say never happened. Will you advise me? And so evaluating whether you take that case, like a John Edwards case, or any of the other people I've represented that are controversial, puts me through my prism. My prism says that is the most active white-collar case that's being investigated. It's a person that's in the White House representing the people, and there's a very good argument that that allegation is not remotely true. So of course I would have said yes. When I say of course, I want to point out it wasn't an of course. I did ask my family. I did ask some friends. I got their feedback, and based on that, I decided that I could or should take this case.
How often do you poll your nearest and dearest?
First time in my professional career.
Well, that's
I think
interesting.
that was the first time. And I'm glad I did. I will tell you, and I'm not, not a family secret, that the most vocal person in that consideration was then so it's 17, that's 6 years ago, was my 16-year-old daughter, who required me to have many conversations with her to explain this, and was my harshest critic to say, don't do it. But nevertheless, it made sense to do. So you asked me what was the difference? The difference was that we were at the beginning of the administration. I don't know that I would have said yes again if I had known what happened throughout the administration, but at the time,
Yeah.
it's what I do for a living. And I've represented, and I want to point this out again, I've represented lots of Republicans in my life. I've represented the former governor of Nevada, Republican. I've represented the senator from Kentucky. I've represented this minority leader
Oh
in
my
the New York
God,
State.
Abramoff, Rostenkowski, Menendez.
Yeah, but Rostenkowski, Democrat, but I've represented
Oh, okay,
former
you're
state
giving us
senator
your
Joe Bruno, and I've represented
bipartisan
Jim
roster,
Gibbons. Yeah.
yeah.
What I'm saying is that I only represent Democrats. I only represent
Right.
Republicans. That's not the criteria. Everybody has their line, but party affiliation is not mine. One last thing I'd say, and I hope this doesn't make me unpopular. Well, who knows what makes me unpopular. But I would say that, look,
Not
when you look
worried.
at the Trump administration, I would be able to give you a legal pad of things that I would criticize and be angry about. But there are some things that I'm not only not angry about, I'm glad about. One of them would be the First Step Act, which was the first sentencing reform in years since the Sentencing Commission in the 1980s. The second was the Abraham Accords. You know what the common denominator of those two were? Jared Kushner.
Thank you. You have experience as the minority counsel, Democratic counsel for the impeachment of Bill Clinton. So when you look at what's happening right now in the House and that they can't pick a speaker, and there's a chance today, it could happen while we're sitting here, that they'll pick a speaker who is leaning heavily conservative, leaning heavily toward the faction in the House that wants to impeach Biden, that wants to investigate Hunter Biden, you know, all these things. What do you see ahead with when they finally pick a speaker? I mean, just the political side of you, the side that understands Congress. How do you see the shakedown of this whole episode, or the shakeout?
So I will answer your question, but again, you used a word that I'd have to stop you and make sure that we have a footnote.
Yes.
You said, as somebody who, quote, understands Congress, end quote. I don't think there's anybody in the Beltway who understands Congress.
Fair
so
enough.
Let's start there.
Well, you understand it better than
Right.
some.
I teach a course at Columbia called Congressional Oversight and Investigations. On the first day of class, I always, at some point in the class, tell my students who are at a New York law school, but they are from all over the country, the following line. I never sleep as well at night when Congress is out of session. So, okay. Having said that, here's two dimensions that's going on that are both fascinating and trouble. In 1998, when Congress impeached President Clinton, I pointed out in the role I played a couple of things. First of all, think about this. In the first 230 years of American history, there had been only one impeachment until Clinton, and then it was two. People think President Nixon was impeached, and he wasn't. He resigned when it was clear in the Judiciary Committee that it was going to be. So President Johnson was impeached and was saved from conviction by one vote. And that was a complicated case because he deserved to be thrown out of office, but not for the things that he was impeached about. And Bill Clinton was impeached and saved by much more than one vote for something that should never have been impeached. When I did my job for the Democrats, one of the things I said, two of the things I said. First, people should think about impeachment as the equivalent of that thing on the wall in many places, probably here at the club, where it's a fire alarm and it says break glass only in emergency. But once you break the glass is broken, and look what's happened since.
Yeah.
We've had numerous impeachments, two of President Trump. We could talk about which ones had the merit to be a high crime and misdemeanor. And now we have what I would say to be a rational fringe in the House of Representatives wanting to find a reason to impeach Joe Biden. Think about that for a second, because what they've said is they've already introduced an impeachment. What's her name? Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene have actually submitted legislation to impeach President Biden. It's one of those things where we'll put the impeachment bill in and we'll find the reason second.
Yeah.
And you know, I use this phrase all the time, but everybody remembers Alice in Wonderland, right? The famous scene where it's the Red Queen who says, sentence first, verdict second. That's what's happening. So on the legal constitutional side, this is incredibly troubling. We have now become a nation and a Congress where impeachment is used for the same thing as passing a bill on the infrastructure. That's nuts. Benjamin Franklin, when the impeachment was being debated among the founders and when the Constitution was being formed, said that you should think of impeachment as the equivalent of regicide, being the model of how you got rid of a king. You killed the king.
You killed him.
We don't think of it that way anymore, and that's a shame. Politically, I think the Republicans made a calculation, and the calculation was that they could energize this so-called base. If I hear the word base one more time in American politics, right? But that they could energize them by this tit-for-tat concept, that if you wanted to go after Donald Trump, fine, we'll go after Joe Biden.
Exactly.
And they thought that maybe that will accrue to their political benefit, because it's all a power play. It's not really about whether there's a constitutional high crime or misdemeanor.
No.
It has nothing to do with that. Which
Scorecard.
Is, again, it's too bad. But I think the last few weeks may indicate to the Republicans, and this would be a good thing for America, and if you're a Democrat, it would be a good thing for the Democrats, that they have realized that their strategy may not be working. I mean, and this whole fight about getting a speaker may be part of it. Who knows what deals are being worked out. But look, Jim Jordan, who could not be a bigger, let's go impeach Joe Biden, couldn't find the votes to get himself to be speaker.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see how this is. But I will say that this is a moment in American history. Look, we have never had this before.
Well, the current leader, contender, Johnson, is a 2020 denier.
He is, and he's closer to Trump than was, for example, Emmer and some of the others, right?
Right, because Trump, I think, has endorsed him, and he did the opposite with Emmer, kind of. Just.
Right, but then, okay, so maybe.
But then you still have to get the 217
right, so that's
votes,
the point.
So
you know, that's the
I don't
point.
know
I
if
mean,
that's going to.
So he gets the 5 holdouts who are on the Freedom Caucus or the fringe right, as I call them.
Yeah.
Okay, but maybe he loses some of the moderate. And also, if you looked at the Washington Post editorial today, it's been one of the background noises, which is interesting. The Democrats could play a bigger role here if they wanted to. For example, if some of them decided to vote present, it would change the numbers necessary. If that were the case, they might have been able to push an Emmer over the top. So I think the Democrats are going to have to figure out what to do about this too.
Yeah, I think the thinking right now is if it doesn't work with Johnson, then it's going to have to go to some kind of possible bipartisan negotiation, which is another week or two of our lives.
I mean, again, just
Sorry.
just as an example of the world we live in, right? Among the things that are interesting about, and interesting is an understatement, about what's happening in the Middle East is that before the war, the internal politics of Israel was very vastly debated and protested, etc. And in the war, what also happened? Bibi Netanyahu had to form a coalition government and bring Benny Gantz and others in. And that's a crisis in the Middle East that caused that. Well, one could make the argument that we're in a crisis in the United States, and having some form of coalition agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats might be the solution. And if that were done, my view of the pessimism I think about government might change, and we might actually be on the road for reform.
Might lift a little.
Might.
Do you have family or friends who are over in Tel Aviv affected?
Did.
Yeah,
Our 22-year-old daughter was taking her semester abroad at Tel Aviv University in a neighborhood where in the first day of the war, rockets were fired close by, and I don't think all of them got stopped by Iron Dome. And we were on the phone with her for 3 days to finally get her and her roommates, find a way for her and her roommate to get out of Israel to Portugal, where her friend's family is from. But I have lots of friends in Israel. And my daughter had a friend in her high school. She went to the Jewish day school here in Rockville, who was the year before her and was that lone soldier who was killed in the north last Friday. And we know him well, and he was in our house. And, there are 10,000 tragic stories now, both on the Israeli side and in the civilian population of Gaza. And he's just one of those 10,000. But it's still significant. Each one of those lives matter, so we do know people.
Yeah, I think the importance of that too, for a lot of Americans watching that split screen here, it diminishes what's going on in the house, because it underscores this is what's going on here when that's going on over there, and that's people's lives.
Yes, it should, right?
Yeah,
it should
I think
sort
it
of
does.
ground all of us. I mean, whenever we complain and criticize about what's going on in our lives, imagine being in a neighborhood where a siren goes off every hour and you have to run to the basement and this wonder of Iron Dome is a wonder, but it's not perfect, right? And so rockets do get through occasionally, and they could land in your apartment building.
Trump has proposed an Iron Dome for the U.S. if he's elected, so stay tuned. One other Trump.
What they would be firing against people who want to come to our country as immigrants. Yeah, I guess, okay, that could be a Trump thing.
One last question about Trump and Congress and the speaker thing. This whole, I don't know if it's just Jordan and Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene vacating the Trump impeachment. Can that be done?
Well, everything that happens in politics today is writing on a page that doesn't have any writing. It's never been
That's
the case
true.
where we're testing whether
well
or not
put.
the Constitution would allow you to undo an impeachment. I mean, they can say it, but the history of the United States and whatever Congress that was, the 100 and whatever it was, will indicate that on a certain day in that year, the President of the United States was impeached by the United States House of Representatives. Following a trial that took place, he was acquitted. And if a new Congress says we want to undo the impeachment, there's no provision for that.
Yeah.
Could they do it? They can pass a rule. Can they? I guess Lauren Boebert, when she does that, will have to go to every high school in America, go to the library, take all the history books and an eraser and try to take it out, but that can't happen.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like, again, it goes back to shouldn't Congress be paying attention to other things? But I'm going to set that aside because we only have about 10 minutes left, and I do want to talk about Hunter Biden, but I want to start by talking about what is a trial lawyer. You know, what is a litigator, and again, I'm the law for dummies, but it seems to me in many cases the case may be going along, and that at a certain point it hits potholes or whatever, and it looks like it's going to probably end up going to trial, and that's maybe when you come in. That you're not always there at the beginning of
Correct.
a case.
Often the opposite. Usually
So,
I'm brought in at some other point.
It's like
often.
we're at the point now where we need to bring in a trial lawyer.
Okay.
And now you, at one point, Hunter had 2 lawyers. The other one was Clark, right?
Right.
And he stepped aside.
Right.
And is that because now the case is such that it's really suited just for your skills? And take this
Look,
any
yeah,
way,
sure.
any
No,
way
I
you want to
get
go
it.
with it, Abby.
It's often the case that some lawyers hired to help a client at an investigative stage, at a preliminary investigation stage, at some earlier stage. And there are lawyers that are incredibly skillful at that and understand the moving parts, and I've certainly, and the people I work with do that. And then there comes a point where somebody knows that she, he, or they are going to be indicted. And you can't avoid it. It's not going to be a deal. There's no deal to be had. The person won't make a deal, whatever. And then a trial is inevitable. And then you look for people with trial experience. Now, by far, there are many lawyers in the United States that have trial experience, but I have, for hook or crook, or whether it was my calling in life or because it just fell into it, I've done a lot of trials and a lot of criminal trials.
Well, you're good at it.
Thank you. I have tried cases in 15 different states in the United States.
Brendan Sullivan says you're the best, so.
Well, if he says that, number one, I have to contribute to the Brendan Sullivan something or other, and him calling me like the best is like, I don't know, I'd probably say that about him. But
Anyway.
So getting back to your question.
Yeah.
So 15 different states, 20 different federal districts, a few state courts. When you do that and somebody's looking for a trial lawyer, they'll look for somebody who tries cases. Mm-hmm. So the fact that somebody might find me as opposed to Sally Smith or John Doe, that's not shocking, especially if you're in the milieu of somebody who does it with high-profile people or political people or people, whatever. So it makes sense. It'd be like, again, if you were looking to fix something in your house, you might not just go to the yellow pages. Are there yellow pages anymore? And pick a painter that says that. You might ask your neighbor, I saw that your house was painted well, who was the painter? So that is a way that people like me can get selected. And so you do find somebody who can do that. And I've had a good track record. And so people can say, not only have I had experience, but somehow I've succeeded. I tell people that my success as a trial lawyer, I'm not being falsely modest. I know I work hard. I know I have enough times to do it that I know how to do it. Mm-hmm. But very often my success depends on the fact that the government does something wrong to charge the person to begin with. It was crazy to indict John Edwards to have made or accepted an illegal campaign contribution for people helping the woman he was having an affair with. That's nuts. So my pointing out to a jury that's nuts, sure, I had to do something, but the path to do that wasn't like rocket science, let's say. But yes, to answer your question, there are people who do this phase and that phase. And when it came to the point of the matters involving Hunter Biden were either going to have to be litigated criminally or civilly, we have a lot of civil cases going on his behalf, then clearly he was going to look for somebody who he could say he knows how to do that. And that's how he and I were put together.
Your goal is to prevent a trial.
Yes.
And
You mean in the criminal side? Yes. So far, he had a deal, fell apart.
yeah.
The prosecutor who made that deal decided he would up the stakes and now bring really charges that have never been brought in his office ever. To charge somebody with possession of a gun while you used to be an addict, when Hunter had the gun for 11 days and it was never loaded, and you then make it into 3 felonies when before you were willing it to be a diversion, is something that bears a lot of scrutiny as to why that would happen. This is an unprecedented charge. So we will attack it as an unprecedented charge, and hopefully we will succeed in showing that it's an unprecedented charge. By the way, given the Supreme Court, whatever you think of them, they passed a number of rulings that make this charge somewhat unconstitutional. We'll have to explore that, and we hope to avoid a trial. But I have every expectation that whatever the motivation, whatever the impetus, whatever the reason that this prosecutor's office brought this unprecedented charge, they may not be done. They may decide they have to prove their point and bring some other case that would never be brought if the person who they were looking at's last name was not Biden or Trump or somebody other than Jones or Smith. So that's the goal.
Do you have a timetable at this point, or is there?
Well, our motions are due in the next month.
Yeah.
So if people are interested in this, they should pay attention to the public docket. So that's a timetable. We do not have a trial date in Delaware for that charge, and there have not been other charges rendered. So we'll have to see. And of course, Hunter may be still fighting and grappling with Congress because they're enjoying it.
Does his father call you up to ask how things are going?
He does not.
Okay, I was just curious.
I will tell you that it's. Does he mean how it's going for him in the presidency or how it's going for his son?
Well, I'm sure you could counsel both, but.
You know, I have been involved with Hunter's family. They are an amazing, close-knit, supportive family. And everybody knows the stories of the Biden family. And I can tell you what you read is the reality. They are supportive and loving and caring. And I've told a number of people we should all have parents like Joe Biden.
Well, on that note, our time is up. This has gone fast because it was so interesting.
Thank you.
It's got to be great to be a student of one of your classes.
It's an open class. Anybody can come. Just tell me ahead of time.
I mean, you know, seriously. I could listen and listen. We didn't get to half of my notes, so please come back.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Good to see you, Abbe.
Thank you for
very
everybody.
much. Thank you. Thank you all.